and welcome back to another episode of United for a Healthy Stoughton. I am so excited to be back in the studio, and I want to, right here at the beginning, say thank you to our friends at Stoughton Media Access for helping us to bring this show back into the studio. And I am here today with a special guest, Amanda Decker. We're talking today about prevention in early childhood. So welcome to the show, Amanda.
Thank you so much.
Great. So just by way of introduction, because I feel like it's been a little while, my name is Stephanie Patton. I'm the prevention coordinator for the town of Stoughton. I manage our OASIS Coalition, which stands for Organizing to Address Substances in Stoughton. And today we're going to talk about an exciting grant opportunity that Stoughton has received around early childhood prevention. And Amanda is here today because she has been doing a lot of consulting with us, and she's working as our coordinator on that grant. So Amanda, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're excited about this work?
Sure. So like Stephanie said, my name is Amanda Decker, and I've actually been in the prevention field since 2001 as a prevention specialist. And one of the things that I love specifically about this grant is that typically when we think of prevention, we're thinking about adolescents and thinking about teenagers, but this grant focuses all the way back even before you're born, and really works to make sure that the community is the healthiest place possible for young people so that they have a chance to grow up and not use substances. And one of my favorite just things when I think about this work is I think about a young person that I met who came back to my office after graduating high school and was in college, and she just said, you know, Amanda, I never used substances. I had all these amazing opportunities, and I'd like to think it's because I grew up in the community that I worked in and never used substances, because I grew up in such a supportive community that had so many things in place to make sure that I never had the opportunity to use drugs and alcohol. And so like hearing those stories and seeing that is really what just gets me fired up to do this work, and seeing it work, you know, seeing the success of it.
Awesome. Thank you. So let's, we have a little slide sort of saying what the grant is, just so people can sort of see where this comes from. So this grant is, it's called the State Opioid Response Prevention in Early Childhood Grant. It's kind of a mouthful. Mm-hmm. We sometimes call it SORPEC in our office. Mm-hmm. It's funded, actually initially the funding comes, it's federal dollars. It comes from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. People know that as SAMHSA. And that money comes to the state of Massachusetts through the Department of Public Health and our Bureau of Substance Addiction Services. And so from there, about a year ago, they did a grant process, and we applied for that funding through our prevention department here in Stoughton. Under the sort of organizational structure of our prevention coalition, we were lucky enough to be awarded this money. And you know, the reason that we decided to apply for this funding is for all the reasons that Amanda said. I think it's really exciting to think about prevention in its earliest form. And so we were fortunate enough to get those dollars. I want to take a second to sort of explain how that's connected to the work we traditionally do, and then I want to dive into the really the early childhood work and talk about what that means, because I think sometimes it's confusing. People think, well, 5-year-olds aren't, you know, experimenting with drugs and alcohol, of course. Fortunately. So that's not really what this grant is about. But I think traditionally you hear us talking about adolescence, and so we know that it makes really good sense to be focusing on prevention during adolescence, and that's really what our coalition work has traditionally been about, right? Adolescence is really the right time to do a lot of those interventions because the adolescent brain is developing so fast and seeks risk. I mean, it's sort of like developmentally appropriate for young people to be trying to find ways to kind of experience risk as part of their development. Their brains aren't fully developed yet, so some of that kind of natural braking system that we have as adults that sort of goes, whoa, maybe that's not a great decision, not totally developed in teenagers yet. So that's where we tend to do a lot of our work. And of course, in our community, we will continue to do that. We also know the data supports, and I think we have 2 graphs up here that show that the precursors for addiction a lot of times often happen in adolescence. So this chart really is about age and the age of first use of alcohol. And so you can really see here that people who start drinking earlier on have a 5 times higher odds of developing an alcohol use disorder than folks who wait till 21. And that's really in large part because the brain is still developing, in fact, beyond the age of 25. And so that 21 number is actually exists for a reason in our culture. There's a slide here that shows something similar around marijuana use. It's the same thing. You know, people who begin using marijuana at an earlier age have a much increased risk of progressing to a marijuana use disorder than individuals who wait until they're 21 when these substances become legal. You know, and our focus really is around prevention. So what happens kind of for folks once they're adults is kind of out of the purview of our coalition work, although it's certainly important in sort of thinking about the health of the community in general. So let's talk a little bit about early childhood prevention and sort of how that connects in that way. So let's think about that for a few minutes, Amanda, and talk about what that maybe looks like in Stoughton and what the research says. And so I think we have another slide that might be useful here that talks about some of the things that put kids at risk or protect them from future use. Do you want to talk through this, like sort of generally a little bit?
Sure. So really, what risk and protective factors are literally risk factors are what puts a young person more likely to have a substance use disorder later on. And some of those risk factors can be things like, you know, they don't have a good relationship with a trusted adult, or maybe there's use in the home, but there's a plethora of different things that put you at risk. And protective factors are really those things that you can put in place that are keeping young people from using substances. And I like to think of, you know, when we're thinking of early childhood prevention, it's a little bit different. You're thinking about like the environment that young child is living in, you know, whether they have the family has mental health issues in the home and stress, and minimizing those risk factors, or maybe there's issues with food insecurity, or perhaps they don't have healthy places to play. But you're thinking of all those things, and when it comes to protective factors, you're thinking of like the opposites of those, you know, and how can we put as many of the protective factors as possible into the community so that that young person has the best chance possible to grow up and not use substances.
Excellent. Great. I think that's a great description of what those things look like. And of course, you know, in adolescent prevention, we look at different risk and protective factors, and things change over time. And as we've been doing this work, and which is new for our community this year, which is really exciting. This grant was funded last summer, so in the summer of 2021. I'm going to make sure I get the year right, because this has been confusing for all of us. And so I think one of the things that I found that was really interesting when we were doing some of the research is this slide that we can show around what we refer to as cascading risk. And so it's sort of thinking about these funnels of things that happen at different points of development and how they, in some ways, can compound for people. And so that gives us different opportunities to intervene. And so when we think about sort of our youngest kids, you know, some of the things that put kids at risk for substance abuse when they're older, you know, not when they're young,
Right.
of course, but like when they're adolescents or later in life, are things like parental addiction in the home, parents struggling with mental health issues, things maybe to do with the temperament of the child. You know, some of us just genetically have more challenging temperaments, and we know that if a child has sort of a more challenging temperament, it impacts the way the parents interact with them. I mean, there's sort of this give and take of if I'm having a hard time as a baby, then my parents or my caregivers might be having a hard time relating to me, and so that can impact our relationship over time. You know, and so then we sort of go to that next level where if that relationship is impacted, that can cause additional challenges, maybe if the family doesn't get extra support, you know. So these are all places where we can think about prevention strategies and helping families who might be struggling with some of these things think about what are some of the skills and protective factors they can bring to their home, because, you know, if we sort of start out with some of these other challenges in place, kids might be having trouble with their own self-regulation, and then as they enter school, and if some of these challenges still continue to exist, it might make it hard for them to have success in the classroom, right? Even at the earliest time, which can become, you know, an unfortunate pattern. So these are all places where we can think about how can we kind of disrupt, right? And get in there and bolster something. So that slide, I think, is a lot about risk, right?
Yeah.
And so I think what's really important, what Amanda was really talking about, is how do we think about the opposite of that? Like, what can we grow, and what's really healthy? So there's another slide here that I think is another really interesting way to talk about that. And there's this thing that we're calling sort of the Swiss cheese model. And so maybe we can throw that up. Amanda, do you want to maybe talk through that a little bit?
So really what this slide is all about is thinking about, like, we know that it's not possible to absolutely make sure that a young person never has a substance use disorder. But what we can do is we can minimize that. And I think we were talking about this a few days ago, even like when we think of the way that our public health crisis with COVID, we think about all the different things people put in place to minimize the risk of getting COVID, whether that's, you know, wearing a mask or washing your hands or all the different public health things that were put out there. You know, some people still could get sick, but a lot less. And it's the same thing around substance use disorder. Is just putting in as many protective factors as possible. And so I like this model because it shows, like, you know, it's much harder for the risk to get through if we put as many layers as possible in.
Yeah, and I think it's great to think about the different types of supports that are really positive too. And so, you know, we think about like how can we support families and give them the tools and the necessary things that they maybe need to have in place to be successful. And that could be thinking about things like policy. It could be thinking about parenting classes. It might be thinking about things like transportation to services that they need, making sure those services are available. So there are lots of places where we can think about that, how we keep people connected, which we know in the last 2 years has been particularly challenging. Because we've been doing a lot of that connection virtually. And so, you know, in our work, and what Amanda's really been helping us to do is to think about how we can understand what that really looks like here in Stoughton and what some of those local things are. So Amanda, do you want to talk a little bit about like who have we talked to try to understand and figure out what this issue looks like here in Stoughton? Like what are the things that are sort of most salient or popping up for families here that might be increasing risk or protecting our kids?
Sure. So one of the first things that we did is we have a group of early childhood care providers, along with other people who have a direct relationship with you know, children who are in that age range from 0 to 11. And so we brought together this group of people, and it's very diverse. It's folks from, you know, the library, from the YMCA, parents, a collective group of people, just to begin to talk about, you know, what's working, what do you see that's working when it comes to working with this age demographic, and, you know, where are people struggling. And so we started to just identify themes that came up, and out of those themes we created a survey that could go out to caregivers of children in this age range, showed all the different daycares or places where young people would go, and the schools, that kind of thing. And so of those caregivers, we narrowed down even another handful of just what we would say risk and protective factors. And we recently created a parent survey to just ask, like, what are we right? Is this correct? You know, do these things resonate with you? And a couple of themes have seemed to pop up. And one of those, you know, predominant themes that we're hearing everywhere is really that difficulty transitioning from, you know, home to school. And some of the folks who work with young people and parents are talking about how, you know, they've raised a child who's never really been in school and in any of these places, or when they have had interaction with other people, it's been at a distance. And, you know, that connection that we think of just so naturally happening hasn't happened. That young person's been at home, and just what are some things that we can do to help that young person. And also some kids are really scared. They're thinking of, they've heard a lot of messaging over the last few years, and how can we help them to feel comfortable with some of these transitions that are happening, and how can we all say the same things. So when a child is going from school to maybe daycare after, or these different places, or the library, wherever they're going, how can we all be saying the same language and be able to have the tools to help that young person transition? So these are some of the themes that have kind of popped up. Another interesting thing that just, I would love to learn more about is just parents saying they want to have places that they feel comfortable for their little person to play outside. And I'm curious to dig down more into that survey information and find out, like, what does this mean? And we're really still at that data collection space where we're trying to really drill down and find out exactly what is happening in our community, and what are some of the positives. There's a lot of good that's happening as well, and being able to champion and celebrate that as well.
Awesome. Yeah. So I think that data collection piece, as Amanda was talking about, which is happening in a bunch of different ways, both in these conversations with folks who who kind of have lots of information about our littlest community members, and then and bringing those people together to have these conversations, to pose these questions, to wonder together, to be curious, and then and to think about their experience. And I think we've also been having a lot of conversations about what is unique about the last 2 years, and what are some of the things that maybe were challenges before and maybe have been exacerbated by COVID, that have sort of gotten worse. What are some things, we always make sure we're asking families and our providers, like, what are the strengths, what's going well for families. And we're hearing a lot of really great things about people really being able to spend time together and foster their relationships even when they were at home. So even though that was challenging, it also was hopeful for people that we spend a lot of time talking about how do we do this balance between hope and concern. They can live together side by side, that, even when things are the most challenging, there are things that are really positive and hopeful that we want to think about growing in our work as well. And finding out from families what do they really need, and what would they take advantage of, and what would be most useful to them at this time, that we can think about supporting with these grant dollars that would really impact the things that our community is telling us are their challenges, and that the research supports as, like, yep, those are challenges that without maybe some extra support can increase risk for kids down the road.
I think another one that just popped in my mind too is just in the survey tool, I've also noticed, there's a demographic of folks where their children never stopped going to, daycare, places like that. When you think of, like, first responders, some of our medical community, and how, you have to put in, like, a bunch of different strategies because they're going to affect different populations. But I know across the board, something that the families were saying is that mental health concerns and stress levels have elevated across the board. And so that's something that you could do, a strategy across the whole entire community to help families with their mental health and stress, related struggles, and just what does that look like for our community, because we know that directly affects that little person.
And I think while we're talking about the surveying and collecting data, I do want to put in a plug that survey is still live. We're still collecting data. There is a link to it both on our Facebook page and also on our website. On the homepage, there's a little banner thing that says, please help us with our early childhood survey. And you can click on that and participate in the survey still to this day. And we're also, we've just recently translated that survey into Spanish and Portuguese. And so those surveys will also be available to folks in the very near future, so that if we can make sure we're reaching all parts of our community in language that they're comfortable participating in a survey.
Yeah.
So that is, and I'll mention that again at the end of the episode as well. So people want to share with us their input. We are focusing on families with kids really under the age of 6. So, our 5, 4, 3, 2, 1-year-olds basically, just because when we spoke to our providers, it felt like that was an area that could use some additional support. We know in Stoughton, there are a lot of services that really become available or are easier for people to find, I think, once their kids are in the school system. And there are a lot of services that are out there that I think people don't always know about. And just sometimes it's harder to get that information when your kid isn't in a structured setting like a school.
Yeah,
So,
that's true.
yeah, so I think that that's important. What else can we share with people about this work? It's so exciting. So we want to talk a little bit about a model that we use to help people to kind of understand what are some of the things we can really think about as a community to put in place, and that's the hope building blocks. And so I think we have one more slide that has a visual of the building blocks. Awesome. And so Amanda, do you want to talk through the building blocks a little bit?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the first is really building those relationships with adults. So making sure that that young person had a caring adult, and inside and outside the home, right? So when you're thinking of them transitioning, to school or whatever, they feel like there's an adult that they bond with, as well as other children, right? So we want them to have, those healthy relationships with our children. The second one is providing safe, stable, equitable environments for living, working, and playing. And that can really look like making sure that a young person, has a playground in their community that doesn't, that's safe and the pieces of it are all together. There's nothing broken. There's no, drug paraphernalia there. It's a safe place for that young person to be. As well as they feel safe at their school, when they go to school, like this is a place where they feel safe. And then creating opportunities to engage with others and build a sense of belonging and connection. And that can look like, play groups, or maybe there's like some kind of community tradition that happens, like community celebration, where folks are feeling like, they belong, they connect, a place of, house of worship that they regularly connect with. And then playing and interacting with others to develop self-awareness and self-regulation. And that's really a lot what we were just talking about, is one of those building blocks that we see the need for a little bit more support around. That is like helping young people to regulate and, transition and feel like they have, emotional stability, and like providing the resources for folks to help them with that. So we also integrated a lot of these into our survey that's going out right now. So if people can, if you're reading through it, you can really identify like, oh, that's why they're asking these questions.
Right.
They're really based off of these building blocks.
Yep. And I think one of the things that I really love about the building blocks, and Amanda and I talk about this a lot, is that the building blocks are really things that anyone in our community can contribute to and does contribute to.
Yeah.
And so I think in a lot of ways, like when I look at these and I think about all the different partners that we work with in our work, really helping people to understand and to name, like, you actually are doing prevention, and maybe you haven't really thought about it that way, or you didn't think, it doesn't look like substance abuse prevention because we're not talking about alcohol or other drugs. But in fact, all of these building blocks are so important, and I think some of them have been challenging during the last 2 years, because a lot of them have to do with interpersonal connection and tend to work better in person. And so, I think this is a really good time for us to be really looking at these building blocks again and thinking about, what do we have? What can we grow? I love thinking about and talking about, some of these community traditions that we have in Stoughton that we love, parades that we do, Stoughton Day. These are all opportunities, and the research says, like, those are great times for families to come together and connect around something that's happening in the community, to help kids feel connected to the community, to help people meet each other, right? Kids to meet other kids, families to meet other families, to build those networks. Some of the programs that we offer through the town and through the school department, or informally when families get together, give kids those chances to practice self-regulation, right? Like if you're, out playing a game with other kids and you're making up the rules as you go and you're trying to figure out how to manage conflict, like those are all skills and things that kids benefit from, those opportunities while they're having fun. Like nobody has to say, like, you are practicing self-regulation, right?
Right. This actually makes me think, so I have a little guy, I have a son who's 6, and he just started t-ball.
Yeah.
And, you wouldn't walk up to that coach and be like, thank you for doing your part with substance use prevention, but I just watch everything that the coach is doing. Like he's teaching the kids to interact with their peers. Yeah, he's teaching them, what it means to be a team and how do you respond when you lose.
Right.
All these different things that are so helpful. And it is prevention, right? Like later on. And my child is in a safe place to play. He loves going to the field. This is a great space for him, and this is his happy spot. But just helping, like one of the goals with this work is, helping people to identify, like, wow, I am doing prevention. Like this fits in. And I'd encourage folks that are watching this, to go to your website and look at some of this work and just to say, help them identify, like, where am I doing prevention in our community? I think it's so important that we even use that language to name that and say, this is that what I'm doing is contributing to, substance use prevention in the long run.
Right. And I think the other thing that's really important too is for adults in the community to think about, you never know when you are having an impact on a young person. You might be that caring adult, and a lot of times we don't know what's happening in people's homes, and sometimes for some of our young people, school might be the safest place for them, or it might be at a house of worship, or it might be at camp. And so you never know, when you might be having an impact on somebody. I think back on my own childhood and think about some of the adults that that were important to me as mentors who maybe never knew that they were having that kind of an impact. And so I think, we talk about that a lot also in our office too, around what does it mean to be a role model for young people? What does it mean to listen to them, starting from when they're really little and providing those safe places, which I think we do really well here in Stoughton, and all the way up through adolescence and beyond.
And I love that it works, right? So we look at the data, we're data people, and we look at the data and just see that by being intentional, putting these things in your community has a direct correlation with use rates for young people and adults over time. And I know that's been true of your community. Like it does work. At the end of the day, you do see a generation of young people growing up and having more opportunity and also having less risk, and having having a substance-free life. And I think that's powerful. I think it's not just something that you're saying and you're hoping, but there's actual data that backs all this up and shows those numbers declining and continuing to decline in your community.
Awesome. And that actually is a great way to wrap up. So I want to thank Amanda for being here today. That went really fast. And if you have questions or you want to learn more, we can put up the contact information. You can find me here in my office in Stoughton. That is my email and phone number. Our website is a good resource. The link for that survey, that early childhood prevention survey, is right there on the front page. We post a lot of what we have going on Facebook. If you're looking to get involved or you want more information, please reach out. And thanks again for watching, and look for more episodes coming soon.